The question has been asked at least since Roman times. Quis custodiet ipsos custodes? Who guards the guardians? During the 1970s, the answer in New York City was apparently no one. No one seemed to be keeping an eye on the NYPD. And as we just saw in the news clip, as many of its members took bribes, ran protection rackets, and consorted with criminals. That changed when cops like Frank Serpico and a panel called the Knapp Commission exposed the wrongdoing and ushered in new measures to keep cops from sullying their badges. Amid today's era of protests about policing, what should we know about the cop scandals of the 70s and the more distant past, and the way New York City responded? We've brought together three experts to discuss that. First, we have Bernard Whalen, who is an active NYPD lieutenant, but is here today as a private citizen and the author of a couple books that expose the history of the NYPD. Welcome, Bernie. Professor Eli Silverman, an expert on policing at John Jay College. Thanks for being here, Professor. And Leonard Levitt, the veteran cops reporter who runs the NYPD Confidential website. Len, I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you.
So, Professor, the Knapp Commission, tell us what it was about. People have heard that name. They've heard the name Frank Serpico. We've seen Officer Phillips testifying. But what was it really about?
The Knapp Commission was a response to a scandal that emerged during this period that Serpico was instrumental in revealing payoffs, pads, drugs being paid to officers. And when the city could not contain this scandal, they had to appoint a commission. And Whitman Knapp was the man who was the head of it, hence it was called Knapp Commission. And it unleashed a barrage of so-called reforms which were intended to contain corruption. Unfortunately, some of those same reforms have been echoed decades later, and they've really just been recirculated. And what we've really been doing is shifting the seats on the ship and not really enforcing command accountability in many occasions.
Len, let's talk about how pervasive this was. During that era, I guess people talked about grass eaters versus meat eaters, people who kind of passively accepted corruption versus those who actively pursued it. But obviously not every officer was on the take. Did we get a sense of sort of how extensive the corruption of the 70s and the 60s were in the department?
Well, it was extensive. I mean, it went right up to the police commissioner's office. There were squads there and squads of the first deputy's office that were involved in this corruption. It was totally organized. It was systemic, and it was heavy duty. I mean, it was part of the culture of the NYPD. Everybody paid, and whether you were a grass eater or a meat eater, it was all pervasive.
And it's important to note that the grass eaters were termed that way because they just went along with it. They weren't aggressive. But the fact that they tolerated the aggressive, assertive meat eaters involved in corruption, that indicated that it had imbued a significant part of the culture of the police department.
Bernie, one of your books is about the first 50 years of the NYPD.
Right.
In fact, that's the title. And it discusses some earlier conversations that echo this one quite a bit. I mean, I think it was the Lexow Commission in 1894 talked about $7 million, which at that point was a lot of money.
It was a lot of money.
So the commissions that have occurred over time, do they tend to be about the same forms of corruption? Is this the same story, or is this a different story over the years?
I think in the earlier days, there were a lot more politicians involved. The police officers and the politicians had almost a symbiotic relationship where in order to get appointed, you had to go to a politician, pay them off to get appointed, and then they kind of owned you. The police department controlled the Board of Elections. So the politicians could get the police to do things to make sure that they stayed in power, and then the corruption would be patronage jobs and things like that. I remember Police Commissioner McAdoo. He had been an undersecretary of the Navy, and he was used to discipline. And when he came to the police department, he couldn't believe how brave guys were, that they would chase down men with guns. But if it was to talk about another police officer doing something wrong, they clammed up. He blamed it, believe it or not, on their Irish heritage.
Imagine such a thing. One question I have is, when you hear about corruption in the early days of the consolidated city, you think Tammany Hall,
Right.
Boss Tweed, and the patronage aspect of it. Did the advent of civil service kind of tamp down corruption, or merely channel it to a different form?
What happened with that is Roosevelt became the president of the police board just before the boroughs merged.
Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt. And he instituted stronger civil service rules. Before, the officer, the candidate, had to pay the politician $300, and the politician could get him the appointment. Now that what happened, the politician said, okay, there's a civil service, but you're going to have to pay me $300 to sit for that exam. So, in fact, the corruption didn't go away. It just got rerouted.
They found a way. So let's talk again about the Knapp Commission. Professor, you talked about reforms, supposed reforms, I think were your words, that were instituted. They were in, what did they consist of, and you think they were ineffective, apparently?
Well, the Commissioner Murphy at the time parlayed off the Knapp Commissioner, and he said, we're going to reform it. How are we going to reform it? We're going to create a new unit called the Organized Crime Control Bureau, and we're going to have an internal affairs unit. The problem was he was holding supervisors accountable for corruption in their units, but that wasn't maintained. And after a while, the supervisors wrote reports, but no one looked at them, no one evaluated them, and he tried to institute command accountability, but it didn't hold, it didn't stick. And to this day, for example, just this administration recently has disbanded the Organized Crime Control Bureau, which was then had folded in detectives and others who were involved in crime-related activities like prostitution or drugs. And they had folded them into the Organized Crime Control Bureau because they were subject to temptation. But now we've just disbanded that. We no longer have that unit. We have an Internal Affairs Bureau. But those detectives and others, investigators, are now moved back to the Detective Bureau, where during Murphy's period, they were taken away. So we've come in a way full circle.
Len, during the 90s, there was the Whalen Commission, which to some degree kind of dealt with, I think in the 60s it was heroin, in the 90s it was crack that was the main sort of genesis for some of the corruption. Was that a different kind of problem, or just something the Knapp Commission hadn't solved?
Well, let me just say that while I agree with Eli, that corruption sort of resurfaces in different forms, the Knapp Commission fundamentally did change the NYPD. It did change the culture. That the corruption after the Knapp Commission was not the systemic, organized. It did not go up to the levels that it went up to during the Knapp Commission. And in fact, with the Knapp Commission, probably the most humorous part of it for me was that Frank Hogan was the Manhattan District Attorney, and he was known as Mr. District Attorney. This was all going on under his nose. His big buddy was this guy, the first deputy, a guy by the name of Walsh. And Hogan, and he used to, anyway, the stuff went on under top people. What happened, but here's the interesting part of this thing that we haven't really talked about, that what they did after the Knapp Commission was that they kept cops out of narcotics, and they kept them out of gambling. And so what that meant was that all this drug dealing in particular was going on, and the uniformed officers weren't stopping it. And nobody wrote about that. Nobody mentioned it. It was like the worst case scenario possible. And Giuliani, to his credit, when he came in as mayor in 1994, he said, this is ridiculous because we're keeping these cops out to try and keep them clean, but the public sees them standing around and not enforcing the laws, and so they assume that the uniformed guys are just as corrupt. And I wonder whether the rise in the serious felony crimes, the out-of-control crime that happened in the 80s and the early 90s wasn't a result of the unexplained, unexpected result of the Knapp Commission's keeping the cops, the uniformed cops, out of the drug dealing.
Control of corruption is really a stepchild of any law enforcement agency. Why? Because how does it get its name? By fighting crime. And generally, corruption only emerges as a focus when there's a scandal, as after the Knapp Commission and the Whalen Commission. But what's happened is, I agree, it's now no longer the rogue cops as much. It's isolated. There are examples, but there's a different kind of corruption in many cases. And for example, in 2000, there's a city agency called the Commission to Combat Police Corruption. Okay? In 2005, they requested this NYPD to reveal its crime statistics. Why? Because they heard that some of the statistics were being corrupted. Okay? Misled. Fooled around with, however you want to label it. What happened, the police department refused to disclose this information, said it wasn't within their purview. They went to the mayor denied them subpoena power. And what happened? The head of it, a respected former prosecutor, resigned. So one constant is the defensiveness of any law enforcement agency to wall off it. So corruption has a cyclical nature, as Bernard has noted, because it comes up roughly every 20 years, which means it emerges. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
I want to ask you about that because that brings up a point that I think the early history goes to too, which is this tension between trying to get the NYPD to police itself versus having some outside body try to police it. That debate goes on today, obviously, but from your research of the history, is there any indication that one or the other approach works better?
I don't know that anyone works better, but they put different spotlights on the whatever the corruption that they're looking at. A politician will look at it for his reasons. If it's an internal investigation, they're looking at it for their own particular reasons. So the one thing that I always say, why there is constant problems with corruption, the same social forces are always at play. They haven't changed. The police department is much the same as it was 100 years ago in the things we're dealing with, the crimes we deal with, the situations we go into and are expected to enforce. Those don't change. So then the same factors 100 years ago are in play with police officers today.
Len, I want to finish up with one quick question. We started this segment with the clip of Officer Phillips testifying. He was caught red-handed, then he became something of a whistleblower. He then did a long stint in prison for a murder that he claims he was framed for as a retaliation. I don't know if that's true or not, but there's always been this question about if a cop comes forward with information like this, will he be targeted for violence or exclusion? Is it any easier today, do you think, for an officer to report corruption than it was for Frank Serpico, for Officer Phillips, for the people that Bernie wrote about?
I don't think so, and Phillips is a great example. I don't know if he was a whistleblower, but they certainly caught him, and if he thought he was getting a deal, he certainly didn't. I mean, he ended up doing, what, 30, 40 years in jail.
Look at Adrian Schoolcraft, who was
tell that story.
Well, he was in a Brooklyn precinct. He recorded conversations in the precinct roll call in which it's alleged that they were asked to look the other way or to reclassify crimes, to downplay them, to arrest people when they should not be. And he went through many, many years of litigation until there was a final settlement. But there was a great deal of controversy. He was extracted from his home by the police department and compelled to go to a psychiatric place. So whistleblower in any institution, New York NYPD is not unique, but there are whistleblowers now who claim that the Internal Affairs has done them wrong. So whistleblowers, it's difficult. You have to be a unique kind of, a different kind of individual to fit that profile.
The PD today looks a lot different than it did in the 70s or even 20 years ago. The composition, gender, and race and ethnicity.
Absolutely.
As that changes, do you think the culture that has permitted corruption changes? No.
I mean, look at the Whalen Commission. You had a situation in the 30th precinct. It was an isolated situation, but 1/3 of the midnight tour was involved in some form of drug dealing. And I remember saying to myself, asking that very question, who are these guys? Are they the old white Irish guys? Are they the young black and Hispanic guys? And I looked at each guy, and it was absolutely 50-50. There were as many, Hispanic cops who were involved in this thing as there were white cops. And so I don't think just putting a different face on this thing changes anything. The culture is the same. And And I think we're seeing that not just with corruption, but we're seeing that with all the black police officers in cities where there have been riots. And the fact that there's a black police commissioner has very little to do with not rioting or whatever. And,
So an equal opportunity problem and a
Absolutely.
fascinating history.
There's a blue culture, but there are many great cops. It's just the culture needs to support them.